Hi, welcome. We're going to talk at you now. All right, this is Transmedia Game Development for Hero Elementary. I'm going to start with some quick intros. My name is Beukema. I'm a game designer at Twin Cities PBS. I work on games that go along with PBS Kids shows, so I get to think about TV also while I'm working on these games. They're educational games, should have said that, yeah.
So, my name is Ramirez. I'm the digital program manager, and I kind of do some game design. I kind of do some outreach with our third-party developers and sort of some of the boots on the ground preparation for that stuff. I also have a background in educational game design and educational research. I'm also an alum of UW Medicine, so it's great to be back. Yeah.
Okay, apologies to anybody that was at our earlier session today. You're going to hear this again. So a little background information about where we're here from and the project that we're working on. Twin Cities PBS is in St. Paul, Minnesota. It's one of the larger PBS stations in the country. We produce a lot of content both locally in Minnesota and also for national audiences. Something we've done a lot of is science shows for kids. Including a show that nobody has seen yet that we're still working on. That is...
A sneak peek.
You get a sneak peek. That is funded by Ready to Learn. Ready to Learn is a 5-year grant from the Department of Education. It's their media money, and traditionally it's been used for funding television shows, and more recently it's also included games and television shows. And in previous rounds, the content area for this grant has been reading and math. You might recognize some of these shows from PBS. And the current round is focused on science. And because TPT has done a lot of science programming, we thought, hey, we've never applied to this grant before, but we're going to give it a shot. And we were lucky enough to be awarded the grant along with CPB and PBS. And a little more about Ready to Learn. It's really focused on early childhood education. It's about school readiness, specific demographics as well. And we are focusing on a little bit of the older age range of that early childhood. So we're really focusing on kindergarten through 2nd grade. We're focusing on science and literacy. And our project is called Hero Elementary. It is about 4 kids who have superpowers, and they go to a superhero school. And while they are still learning to use their superpowers, they're also learning to use the superpowers of science. And so they are going on all kinds of adventures where they're solving problems and helping their community. And it's a very large project. We have 80 animated segments that we are developing, so 80 episodes. We're also working on almost 20 games, 19. And we also have other pieces to this project. We are developing an outreach program, so we have a lot of resources that we're developing for educators to use with kids around the country. And also because it's a Ready to Learn grant, it has a large research component, and so we have research touching almost every piece of the project. A little bit more about Hero Elementary. We are standards aligned. We're working with the next generation science standards, English language arts, Common Core, the science and engineering practices. Our audiences are we have a pretty specific audience that we're targeting. We're targeting kids from low income households, kids that live in Latino communities, kids that are English language learners, and kids with disabilities. So we are thinking very broadly about equity and universal design for learning across our whole project. Here's some of our team. As you can imagine, we have a very cross-disciplinary team. We have researchers, we have educators, we have television folks, we have people that have been running programs in schools. It's a very collaborative, really fun project to work on, and yeah, everybody gets to learn a lot, I think, since it's so cross-disciplinary. Here are some of the people we're working with to build all of these games. We have a lot of games that we are building, and so we have to work with a lot of different people. You probably recognize some of these people. I know we have some filament people here. So first, I thought I'd give a little 2-minute transmedia overview for anybody that is not familiar and has never thought about transmedia. So it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's about using different kinds of media on different platforms. Hi. And it's really from the perspective of storytelling. So it's about transmedia stories across just anything that you can think of, books, movies. An easy example I like to use is Harry Potter. Any Harry Potter fans? Yeah? Yeah, so you already know what I'm probably going to say. It is a huge universe with books, with movies. You can go walk around Diagon Alley in real life. You can play games where you're attending Hogwarts. It's a really huge universe. And that's really what we're thinking about. We're thinking about developing content that goes in lots of different places. We're thinking about more than just adapting, say, a book to a movie. We're thinking about telling different parts of the story, adding to this universe. So you might have some characters that are secondary characters in one place and is a main character in another place with different stories. You might be exploring different locations, subplots. There's all kinds of things you can do. The white space is something really cool to think about as well. So fan fiction is a really good example of that. These are places where your audience can interact with and create content and be part of this universe that you're building. And we're thinking about all of the different ways that we can connect these different kinds of media and different platforms. And you can be really creative about this. You can do things that are really obvious, like have characters from your TV show or movie inside of a game. You can also do things that are a little more subtle, like taking a piece of a plot from one place and using that as a jumping off point for an entirely new plot somewhere else. There's a lot that you can do, and you get to do some really fun stuff. So now that you guys are experts in transmedia, we're going to talk about some of the benefits and cool stuff that comes out of this approach. So the kind of main thing is that you have a much bigger, much richer world when you are occupying all of these different spaces and using all of these different platforms and different kinds of media. You have many more settings, you have many more characters, you have lots and lots of stories that you can tell. And that is super engaging. So you have content that is just inherently much more engaging for people because there are so many ways that they can interact with it and experience it. For example, you could go to Pottermore and be sorted into a Hogwarts house. We're both Slytherin. Sorry, yeah, not sorry.
You can tell our employees on the interview, though.
So yeah, places where your audience can participate in your world is really powerful and really engaging, and is a very, I'm going to say powerful again, a really powerful way to get your content across to the people that you are trying to get involved in your world. And that's especially true for educational content. Another thing that's really awesome about transmedia is that you can build on what the strengths are of each platform. So really thinking about what are the things that books and movies do really well, what are the things that games do really well, and how can we capitalize on that for this world that we're building. And when it comes to educational content, hey, you get to think about all of that educational content from different perspectives and ask your audience to do that as well. And so they can come at it at different angles. There's lots of different entry points for this content. Whatever their interests are, you can really meet them where they are and bring them into your world. And more exposure. There are lots and lots of ways for them to experience this content because you have so many different ways. Challenges. Transmedia is not easy. It does have some challenges to it because everything has to exist in the same universe. Consistency. You have to have some consistency and some believability of this all exists in the same place. It's all part of the same thing. And for us especially, developing this new property called Hero Elementary, it's been an even bigger challenge, specific challenges around having a show and a world that's still being developed and still evolving. And so we have a show Bible that our television team is working on, and that's kind of the roadmap of this world. So what are the characters in your world? What are the rules of your universe? What are the things that do happen? What are the things that can't happen? What are the places in this world? What are the personalities? Like, how are the stories told in this world? And that's something that has been evolving, and yeah, and as it changes, we kind of have to think on our feet to still keep the games matching that. And then the art Bible, so what does everything look like? As you can imagine, when you're making games, you need to figure that out. And as that's been something that's evolving, that's been really challenging for us as well, because we need to make these games without knowing exactly what the universe is going to look like. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how we've kind of approached that across our different games that we're talking about today. And yeah, on to the games that we're talking about. We're going to talk about 3 of them.
So we're going to give a quick overview of 3 games that have been sort of produced out of this Transmedia world, and how they connect into things like the TV show, like the books and stuff that might be released with this, the comic books. And like you saw earlier when you saw the different types of art styles, you can imagine how much of an impact that actually has on the characters, right? So if they're drawn in a certain way for a long time, you have this idea of what those characters are. And especially with a property that's starting out, like right now, it's starting from scratch, essentially. We have a book that it's kind of based on, and it loosely follows the idea of this world. But honestly, beyond that, it's grown into something completely different. And so as it evolves, you start to sort of feel differently about the characters on one point in time. And that can severely impact how they're used inside of a video game or even on TV. It might make sense for a script to say, oh, well, this character now has a phobia that maybe they didn't have in a previous one. That can be good or bad, right? Because if that phobia is important in a video game, maybe that's not the character that you want to put in. Maybe you have to put in another one. Alternatively, maybe that phobia is something that makes the character more believable. Maybe you can connect with them more. So that's something that you can lean into. So it's interesting to keep track of that. In addition to that, since everything's starting from scratch, the art that's coming out and the production is also kind of in parallel, which is cool, because that means that not only does TV set the space, some of the stuff from the games also bleed over into it, which is nice. So we can introduce characters, or we can use background characters that maybe only appear once in a TV show, and we sort of flesh them out. So yeah, this is an example of one of those games. This is the Family Science app. And this app was, the idea behind this from a transmedia approach is to play with the superheroes, right? So we want you to be able to interact with them. You want to be able to use their superpowers of science and approach an interesting problem with them. So, and just like TV, right? So over time, we've been developing catchphrases and different sorts of things like the superpowers of science using the superpower of observation. And we're really trying to lean into that in terms of a mechanic of what you can do at home. So in this case, you're going to be using essentially deduction and testing. So you're going to be applying a bunch of different tests to a mystery animal and sort of identifying like, what kind of animal would it be based off of these tests? So here's a quick walkthrough of how that might actually happen. So you would open up the app. Oh, and something important about this one is this one's geared to be played by kids and their older family members, because we do want that conversation to happen. Something interesting that happened, especially with this one, that we'll talk about a little bit more, is just sitting down with the community that you're trying to service and trying to understand what their approach to science is in the first place, right? And we got some interesting information, including science is something that's out there. It's not something that affects our day-to-day life, right? So we were trying to identify, well, how can we change that perception? We had a great talk with the Fred Rogers Foundation, and they sort of said one of the most rewarding things for them when looking at a Daniel Tiger app or a Mr. Rogers Neighborhood app was getting the family interested about something and saying like, I never thought about the moon in that way. If you can get them outside to look at the moon and think about questions, then you've done your job in terms of like spreading that idea that science is something that the family can do. So we kind of want to run it in that direction. So you open up the app. It's going to be on iOS or Android, specifically for mobile devices because it has a larger market penetration. And then you would choose a category of things that you might want to identify. So again, we're trying to limit it to things that are around you. So animals are common, foods are common, like different types of plants are around you. We want it to really connect with things that you can see in your day-to-day lives. You would then be able to identify one of your superhero characters And each one of these characters has a superpower that you can go ahead and use to your advantage, right? But the secret is that these powers aren't really superpowers, right? So the Magna goggles, you can zoom in on something, but honestly, that's just using a microscope, right? And we're trying to make some of those ideas explicit, so that after you play through it and you get excited about like, oh, I really like our character. He was named Stan right now. He's now named AJ, another one of those transmedia sort of changes. But the idea that like, oh, Stan has this cool gadget. Does a gadget like that exist in real life? And if it does, that might make the kid excited about like maybe doing this test later. So you choose one of these tests, and then you get a short little cutscene about like your character actually performing that test on this mystery animal in a box. And you get information, you collect pieces of information to help you deduce what this mystery animal could be. So in this case, if we say that it has feathers and it sleeps during the day, we might be able to deduce that it's a vulture. But let's pretend, right, that we selected other animals that don't exactly fit. That's okay. We want to be able to allow for failure because that sparks discussion. So we want to slowly reveal what matches, what doesn't match, and really emphasize that maybe you need more to collect more information to make a more informed decision about this. So eventually, you're going to get it right, and you're going to identify which one of these animals meets the criteria, and you unlock it in your science journal, so you can go back and actually test out all the different tests surrounding it, so you're not just limited to the ones that you chose. There were a lot of cool things that went right with this. It's replayable, so all of the characters have a very from a data perspective, they have a very interesting structure. They each have to have pieces of information that are associated with a test, and there's six unique tests for categories. The categories have subcategories of like what types of animals are found in the farms, what types of animals are found in a city, and those can be randomly generated as well. But that also allows us to create content that the kids actually incorporate content that the kids make. So part of our app also allows them to say, take a picture of their cat and then answer the questions about like, how heavy do you think this is? Does it have fur? And sort of walk them through that idea and incorporate that item that they create into the game. So that's trying to bring it full circle in terms of the science that you're doing in this app and playing with superpowers is also something that you can actually incorporate from your daily life. So that's kind of cool. So some challenges from this, from a transmedia perspective, was that art wasn't final throughout the evolution of this game at all, and you'll kind of see that as a recurring theme. So with any TV show, if you've worked on a TV show, everything's pretty much in flux because you're trying to get it approved by your audience. You're trying to get it approved by the higher-ups, by making sure you don't step on copyrights, different sorts of things like that. Mm-hmm. So the characters evolve a lot. So part of how we approach this is to find a local artist in Minneapolis, right? Mm-hmm. And who created some awesome characters. The art that you've seen here is all his work. Mm-hmm. So that sort of steps in as like a placeholder for the finalized art when the TV comes in. But you've got to plan for that, because eventually we're going to flip over all the art and it's all going to be streamlined. It's a transmedia world when it makes sense, so you have to be able to make that consistent as well. But sometimes it doesn't work in terms of timeline, so you have to roll
improvise.
With that. Yeah. We also had some narrative difficulties around some of the game narratives, and essentially what is appropriate, say, like for PBS and for the target audience. So supervillains isn't necessarily something that you might want to incorporate. So we were trying to think in terms of like, hey, what actually puts the animal in this box? Maybe it's like a collector, like a supervillain collector or something like that. And you're trying to release it by identifying what it is. But at least in this type of world, in this type of character, supervillains don't really fit in it. There's not really like a supervillain school in our world. So it kind of opened up a lot of cans of worms, which are kind of crunchy, but at the same time, they diverge a lot from our show Bible. So we decided to cut back on that. We also decided that we wanted to change our approach to assessment. So In this case, we're collecting telemetry data about what the kids are doing throughout the app. And part of it is actually going to inform how we choose the mechanics and the flow of the game. So that's ongoing too, because we're working with researchers in terms of how do we interact with our target audience, how do we get the information, and how do we determine if that information tells a coherent story about how they're interacting with the content. So here's an example of like the evolving art styles and stuff like that. We can see even from this scene, a lot of things change from this to the final placeholder art. Some things you might not even consider, but are very important when you have to make a cohesive transmedia world, like the size of the box. If this box is a one-size-fits-all sort of deal, how can an elephant fit in there? So you have to think about these things that might lead to misconceptions later on with the kids. And slowly address that so that maybe you don't have them in the same frame. And so maybe the frame of reference is an extreme close-up of the box so that the size of the box remains ambiguous. Different sorts of things like that sort of pop out. And a good way to identify that is not just with wireframes like you saw previously, but also with user testing and just putting it in front of kids. Kids will have no problem telling you if you're wrong. So some successes around this are, it went really well when we incorporated our target audience. We got some excellent design decisions about what they can and can't do during time. So one thing is the amount of time that people have to play games with their kids varies wildly from parent to parent. And so one of our design decisions was to try and make a game that has a very quick game loop that encourages multiple play, right? So what you saw there in terms of like making tests, at, determining what's inside this box, we did it specifically in small chunks because the idea would be that you play multiple of those in sessions and you are kind of surprised by the different types of animals that come out. We have a huge bank of animals, so every time you play, you'll probably have a different set of tests that you can perform, different superheroes, and different animals that you're assessing. So there's always something new, something kind of crunchy. And by making it quick, it can also fit into a very busy lifestyle. So maybe there's only a little bit of time where you're maybe waiting in an office or at the doctor's office, somewhere where you don't have a lot of time. Fits perfectly into that. It also fits into longer game nights because you can play more rounds and keep score. So things like that where we talk to the target audience and sort of get their feedback, use that as design points, are very, very important and were a great success for us. The core mechanic was also really helpful because even if the stories change and the specifics about like whether there's a supervillain or not, the idea that you're performing tests, at the heart of this, you're performing tests on the world and using that information to make an informed decision, that stays the same. That doesn't change if the script changes, that doesn't change if the characters change necessarily. And so that's great. And we really try and look at mechanics that meld well with the concepts that we're trying to teach. We don't just try to put it as a narrative layer. Yeah, and then using the individual powers of the superheroes. You might be able to see them perform some of their powers on TV, but isn't it cool that you can actually say, like, I want you to use the superpowers of science here? Kids think so, so we must be doing something right. So I'll give it to Laura to talk a little bit about Super Search and Rescue.
All right, so this was one of our earlier games, and so it had a kind of a different set of challenges that I'll talk about. So from a transmedia perspective, this game was actually based on a specific script that was in development at the time that included robot elephants, because why not? And yeah, it was about finding these robot elephants that had been accidentally unleashed onto downtown Citytown. That is a place now. I just love saying that, downtown Citytown. And trying to find all of them and bring them back before havoc is just wreaked on the city. And we got to do some cool things with that. It started off as the television show being kind of the basis for what the game concept was, but then that television script went away and it doesn't exist anymore. And so then it was kind of became the reverse. We kind of had to switch gears a little bit and inform some new shows that were not in development at the time and say, hey, we already have this game that's about maps and finding stuff with maps, and here's stuff that you could include in a new show. And because we work so closely together with all of the people that work on the different pieces of this project, we got to really work together on what that could be, and they were able to come up with not one but 2 scripts that have connections to this game, which is really fun. So the goal of the game is to find these missing elephants. And on each level, there's a new elephant that you need to find. And you are using maps to find them. So for this game, we're talking about maps as models of the real world. We're talking about different landforms and bodies of water that might be found on maps. And using all of that to find these elephants. One thing that's really interesting about this game that we got to experiment with a little bit, it is a 2-player game. It's a local 2-player game, so it's on the same device, and it uses kind of a pass and play, taking turns. And there are some parts of the game where players are asked to work together, and some parts where they are individually doing tasks. And so an approach that we took with this was to be really explicit about, okay, player 1, it's your turn. Player 2, it's your turn. Okay, now work together. And we found that that worked really well with the kids that we tested with because they needed that extra help to share a device, which, as you can imagine, with the younger kiddos can be a challenge. And yeah, that really facilitated that kind of turn taking. And we were actually pleasantly surprised with the way that the kids interacted with each other with the scaffolding. They would actually ask each other first before being like, oh, it's this right here. They'd say, can I help you with this if their partner was struggling? So it was a really fun experiment for us to try a 2-player game. For the single individual player tasks, they are given a clue about where the elephant is and asked to match it to something on the map. So for this part of the game, they are trying to figure out how the clue that they are given is represented on this map and where is it, and finding it. And after each player has done that part, then they are tasked to work together to figure out, okay, we have our 2 clues now. Where is the place that matches these 2 clues? Where should we go to look for the elephant? Where is the elephant? And then they get to look for the elephant. So actually the part that I think a lot of kids enjoyed the most, oddly, because it's not super interactive, but after you get to the place that the elephant is, you can look around in a sort of 360 like panoramic deal to find the elephant, and kids just got so excited when finding the elephant in this part of the game. I mean, I guess they did have to do a lot of work to find it, but yeah, it was really fun for them. And a little bit about kind of the earlier parts of the game, the setup. The game introduces kind of one at a time different features that would be on a map first, and in different contexts. So showing it as like what the object actually looks like, being the representation that's on the map, and then slowly becoming more abstract, where a building might just be a rectangle instead. So different human-made features, land features, water features, and there is a legend in the game too, as a kind of reference if kids need help with what is the thing that is representing the lake in this map, on this level. And yeah, so the maps do get bigger and more complicated and more abstract, and the clues get harder, and figuring out exactly which part of the map the elephant is in does get more challenging. There are other clues about thinking more about the relationship of where objects are on the map. So if it's near a lake or far away from a lake, those kinds of things we have in the game as well on the harder levels, which is great for our older kids. One thing that we're really thinking about when we're developing these games is because our audience is K through 2, so kids that are 5 through 8 years old. There's a lot of difference there between the youngest kids and the oldest kids, and even within the same age group, there's a lot of differences with their abilities, with how long they can even sit still for a game. There's all kinds of things that we have to consider. So we're really thinking about making each of these games engaging enough that a second grader can still feel challenged and get something out of the game, but also that even a kindergartner can sit down and play this game and get something out of it, even if they can't ever get to the hardest things that are in the game and the most challenging levels. So challenges of the game. Nothing was finalized. The script changing on us was a big hurdle to have to get through. We still have elephants right now, but they're going to have to be taken out because there are no elephants anymore. It was one of the first games out of the gate, and so it was at a time where nothing was really finalized. We kind of knew, we knew what the world was. We knew there was a superhero school. We knew there were kids with superpowers, but what kind of superpowers the kids have, what the kids' personalities are, whether or not there's villains, something that Dennis mentioned, that was all kind of unknown. And so that makes it difficult. And budget-wise and timeline-wise, that was also a challenge that we ran into. So with that pivot from what we were basing the story on for the game, we kind of had to go back to the drawing board a little bit and think about, okay, if there's no robot elephants to find, then what's the game about now? Luckily, though, what was also a success for the game was that the mechanics that we had in the game about finding something and using maps to find something could really be about anything. It didn't have to be robot elephants, and so that ended up really working out for us, that we didn't have to go in and redesign the game. We could just adapt pieces of it to make sense with what the new world was and new stories. And yeah, the kind of placeholder art that we had to put together, that was another solution success that we had versus waiting for TV art to come down the pipeline. We just decided, all right, we're going to just make an art Bible for ourselves, and we're going to finish all of the games with this, and we'll worry about going in and changing the art later. It's not ideal, but it was an approach that let us at least finish the games and polish those experiences and have games that were done. And all right, game number 3.
Yeah. All right, so the next one was heating and cooling. And as you can see, each one of these games were really trying to zero in on a very specific science and engineering practice, right? And next generation science standard. Mm-hmm. Some of these do cover multiple things just because of how interconnected some of the content is. Mm-hmm. So example, the heating and cooling one also deals with solids and liquids. But generally, we try and keep our scope in terms of how we want to approach it to one of those topics and sort of build out from there. If they're interconnected and they work well with gameplay, sometimes we expand it. But so this is an example where that worked. So yeah, let's talk about heating and cooling. So some cool things about it from a transmedia perspective are that we get to see downtown Citytown. So at this point in development, we had only talked about it in terms of script writing. There weren't necessarily any scenes about how downtown Citytown looked or what is in downtown Citytown. It was very amorphous. So we were able to use that to our advantage because no one can tell you if there's a library there, so we have full range to build a library there. Actually, we took it a little step further and we allowed kids to be able to produce this themselves. So they could choose where the buildings were in downtown Citytown, and some of those designs are actually going to be worked into the TV show in the future. So that might actually be a really cool transmedia sort of event where a kid says, "Oh yeah, I built that building," and then later on when they watch the TV show, it's in the background. Oh man, isn't that awesome? Mm-hmm. So it's stuff like that we were able to really sink our teeth into. We were also kind of open to being able to check out different characters and add different characters that supported the idea of heating and cooling. So we needed to interact with the city people as part of our idea for this game of giving back to your community, building up the community, which was something that was kind of important with our focus group as well. And so we had to populate the city again. When we're starting from scratch and looking at scripts, you might introduce a new character in one of the scripts, and maybe not often, but it's a city. There's a lot of people there, so we still had a lot of room to introduce our own characters. The goal of heating and cooling is to use your powers of heating and cooling to help others improve downtown Citytown. And I'll walk through the game a little bit so that you understand how that works. So the game starts off with our view of downtown Citytown, and for a long time this was the reference image that we used to inform other parts of the project, like what is downtown Citytown. And you can see here that it's under construction, and that's really cool because the kids are excited to be able to build up, right? But right now, you start off kind of small, and it opens up the world, so kind of the standard trope of any sort of upgrade building game, right? You identify as someone that you want or needs help, and in this case, they need help with their wheelbarrow. When we were thinking about heating and cooling, one of the interesting mechanics that sort of came up from it was the transition changing from like one form to another through the use of heating and cooling. And we thought that that would be a great way to introduce it here as a superpower that was available to you that you could use to make the life better of the inhabitants of downtown Citytown by fixing things like this. So this is currently in beta, so not everything is complete yet, but here you can see the idea that you have materials. In this case, you're melting down chocolate. In the final version, when you're building a wheelbarrow, chocolate probably isn't going to work to replace a wheel. You'll probably have rubber. But in this case, we find different types of materials that you can heat up. They will melt. They'll fall into a mold, and then the mold can be frozen and actually made into something solid. And that something solid can be placed into the object that's broken to make it better, to make it to fix it. So that's kind of the main core game loop. The idea is that you will be melting a lot of things. You will be freezing a lot of things. Those are your powers. And generally the approach that we want to take to educational games is we don't want the content to be an obstacle. We want the content to be something that you understand and you can use to make things better. So that's a slight distinction, but I think it's a very powerful distinction that we try and incorporate. And yeah, so after you're helping the city, you start to unlock different parts. So after you get a certain amount of stars, individuals sort of pop out and say like, hey, you're really good at melting things and putting them together and making small models or fixing things. Like maybe you can help us by making a model of a building, and then we'll go ahead and put it up. So this is kind of going back to this idea of like that transmedia thing of, oh yeah, maybe I want to build a gallery or a library. And it's kind of scaffolded, so they kind of have to fit a shape. The puzzle's still there, but there still is some ownership behind it in terms of like, I built this thing. Maybe the specifics aren't there, like the awnings, the colors and stuff like that, but the actions of creating something from a heap of materials, something recognizable, is really powerful there. So when we're working in transmedia, our developers also have a lot of fun with it. So in this case, we're still at the concept art phase, right? So we were experimenting with different sorts of ways to show progression to the players. So whether that's like a newspaper, kind of like in a classic SimCity sort of style, our third-party developers also have fun with that and sort of mess around with the idea of like, oh, what could be in a downtown Citytown Tribune sort of deal. I like the top one the most, like, sheeps, what are they? How can they help you? Are you a sheep? I don't know. You know, and with this age group, that's a great way to sort of introduce that and to ask those questions, because it is kind of silly, it's kind of fun, and it's a way to interact with it, and incorporating it into the newspaper to some kids feels like it's a more prevalent question, right? It's something out there, something that they should sink their teeth into. So, challenges. We did have limits in terms of what we could do with the world. So there was a mechanic that we had to scrap about, we wanted you to build whatever you're building out of any type of material. But we also wanted to include this idea of like, but if you make this statue out of chocolate, is it going to survive if it's in an arid desert climate? So we wanted to have different sorts of biomes in downtown Citytown. But we felt that that was a bridge too far. Are there any Simpsons fans here? Sort of? Okay, so there's the ongoing joke of like West Springfield being like an amorphous sort of thing. It has harbors, it has deserts, it has all that stuff, right? And so we were trying to, from a design perspective, say that, like, maybe we could have a cold biome of like the top of the mountain or something like that. But it is getting close to a science show, right? At the core of it, it's a science show. And so we do have to have a lot of talks about what is okay to take these sort of chances with, bending the truth slightly, and what we really have to be focused on. And usually we err towards, if they're NGSS science standards between K and second, we try and keep that as specific as possible to try and not introduce misconceptions. At the same time, it's an interesting conversation because on the one hand, you have kids with superpowers, right? Talking about science, and you got to make sure that the science is right. But the fact that she can fly, let's not talk about that. Or on the other hand, we're introducing real animals, right, in one of the examples that you saw before. But they also have a class pet who has super speed and can sort of speak with emojis. Like, where that line is kind of blurry, but it's really fun to try and see where you can push on that. Mm-hmm. Also, new characters. That means a lot of voices when it comes to VO in a game. Thankfully, some of our successes are that we were able to use a narrator. So from the start, they said it was a superhero show. There has to be like a narrator that says like, meanwhile, and whatever. And that was great from a gameplay and design perspective because they could be omniscient and they could sort of tell you like, hey, this person needs help. You're a superhero, you can do that. So that's great because that doesn't mean we have to have a lot of voice actors and a lot of voice actor files. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we still get to keep our characters, so we still have a wide gamut of different people interacting with. As you can see, it's mostly first person. So in this simulated world, you kind of step into the role of being a hero. So where in the Family Science app, you're kind of working with the supers, and in Super Search and Rescue, you're kind of being on the team. Here, it's a very first-person sort of approach, and you can actually use superpowers of heating and cooling. So that's kind of cool because it's allowing you to step in, which kind of goes back to our examples of like Harry Potter, where you can be sorted into different houses. So here's a chance where you can be a hero. And yeah, like I mentioned, you have a chance to influence downtown Citytown. It's alive, it's growing, and you're the one adding things like the library to it. That's kind of cool. So, big takeaways. So how do we approach this now that we've talked a little bit about like all of these challenges and all these things to watch out for? Something that I would say is like, if you're going to approach something like this, try and have a lot of pre-production. Try and get the ideas out onto paper, onto prototypes, so that you can really get what the game's about. If it's a narrative sort of based game where the narrative will break pretty easily, if your world isn't established, that might be a very difficult thing to pull off.
Robot elephants.
Right, robot elephants being a great example of that. So generally when we approach a topic, we try and have a sort of game jam of different ways that we can approach it. In this case, these were some of the prototypes that came out of the code design process for the Family Science app. And you can see they're very, very different. And some of them, the last prototype is actually pretty close to the idea, to the mechanic that we took to be in the final game. So you could actually test like the individual parts and identify different components of it. So in that case, you had superpowers of like sniffing, tasting, touching, and you would get their ideas. But we had a whole bunch of cool stuff that came out of that too. And we can still use those ideas later. Or if the mechanic doesn't work and we need to pivot, we also have these ideas sort of in the back burner, so that's helpful. Paper prototyping, like I said, is super helpful too. Getting any sort of prototype in front of your target audience as quickly as possible is helpful. They will tell you what's wrong with it, they will break it. But the cool thing about paper prototypes is if you forgot a button, you can whip out a Post-it, draw a button, stick it on, and then you have a button. This saves time and money, and it can inform really quickly what some of the UI affordances that you need to look out for are. On the same note, wireframes are great to sort of get across what the game is about. So if you missed our previous session about pushes and pulls, wireframes was a core component of that and of most of our games. But the idea is to communicate what the game's about in a way that you can sort of fake the final product. So you can see here, all the elements of the final game are in place. It's very easy. I don't really have to tell you all what this is in order for you to kind of identify, oh, it's kind of like a platformer. You can drag things from the top to the bottom. A lot of that's conveyed quickly. If you string it together, you can also have an idea of how the gameplay works, and you can identify any problems quickly. So in the first iteration of this, we kind of had it like a Portal-ish sort of game where you were destroying boxes, right? But this, we were able to take the wireframe, put it in front of subject matter experts and our target audience, and identify some interesting components that we might not have seen otherwise. And if we had waited to do that, it would have cost us time and money. So for example, lasers. Lasers can be scary. And we're trying to approach it with an idea of silly, goofy, not scary. So it's not necessarily that the laser's bad, but we can modify it slightly, and we can still get the idea that we want. So we can change it into like a goo gun or something like that. And it removes some of that danger, but we still keep the mechanic. But being able to see that through a wireframe, we can talk about it very quickly, and we don't have to have this idea of what we think the game's going to look like based off of just like text or reading. Same sort of thing. We were experimenting with different types of surfaces as like a puzzle mechanic. But at this grade level, there was some pushes. The idea was that you would use pushes and pulls as your main sort of mechanic, as your superpower. And this complicated things. It was interesting in that it gave us a lot of puzzles, but we can make plenty of puzzles by just messing around with pushes and pulls. So this allowed us to really think about, do we want to introduce another one of these variables? Maybe later, maybe that's a good idea, but for right now, this could be something that opens up misconceptions, and we were able to identify it now before we started programming it. Also, the not so obvious things. It's kind of terrifying to kids to have an open chasm where it's just like a bottomless pit. But that's easy because we can sort of say like, all right, maybe it's not bottomless, maybe we put a trampoline, something safe at the bottom there. But it's interesting because this is one of those core mechanics of video games like platformers that you might miss and that are kind of there. But seeing it on paper and having like subject matter experts in the room or your target audience in the room lets you identify and make these design choices quickly. Again, once you have digital prototypes and paper prototypes, you can really test the assumptions early and often so that revisions can be made to the project. And yeah, pay special attention to what your audience likes and what they have trouble with. Mm-hmm. Very quick example of like the process of how that evolves into something like that over time. But with the wireframes, you at least have this idea of where you're wanting to go. You can control the content. Like we mentioned before, you can be very specific about what you're trying to address in terms of the NGSS standards. And we find that identifying that early and sort of nailing that down and allowing it to grow organically if possible is good. But just keep that in mind because not every game will cover every single thing. So try and play to your strengths. What we've found helpful in this process is to produce science quick takes, which is kind of the analog to a one-page game design doc. So this would be a science game design doc that has all the information about like common misconceptions, what are the main goals of the game, and done in such a way that you can give it to someone who's new on the project who might not be associated with the science, and they can get it quickly because once everybody's on the same board, you can ask better questions. Yeah, and again, choose your mechanics carefully. Something that has really served us well was it's not that you can't approach it in terms of a arching narrative, and sometimes there's some great stories that come out of that. But when you're starting with a transmedia property that is completely up in the air, sometimes you have to be able to switch. So really think about the core mechanic. What are the actions? What are the players doing in your game, because that should be connected pretty closely to the content that you're trying to teach, because you can actually do it inside of this simulated space. And that has some cool outcomes. So yeah, thank you all for listening to us. I was Dennis Ramirez.
Laura Beukema.
And you can talk to us anytime. If you all have any questions, we're here. Thank you.